We're live.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kathy Brown. I'm the director of the Alice Paul Center for Research on Gender, Sexuality, and Women, and the program on Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. I want to welcome you to our event today. It's our first virtual event during this period of closure because of the pandemic. And our event today is called Under Quarantine. It is a community, a reflection on our community and collective action under plague, both this plague and plagues in the past, surveillance in times of emergency, and social intimacy during times of illness. I also want to mention that at GSWS, we have come up with a statement reflecting on the ways that the pandemic have highlighted inequities and injustice in American society, really exacerbated those inequalities and also put incredible pressure on people who are trying to juggle paid work and unpaid care work, as well as sometimes paid care work. So please look for that statement. It will appear on our website and also circulate among our GSWS faculty and student affiliates. What I want to do, we have a really exciting program for you today. I want to introduce each person who is going to be participating in the program, and then I will disappear for a little bit and just appear again to give them the signal that it is their turn to speak or perform. So I'm just going to start with these general introductions. Our first performer is Shana Bahemat, who will be doing an opening meditation for us. Shana is the program coordinator at FQT-GSWS, whose work explores intergenerational trauma and creative writing through the frameworks of women of color feminisms, queer politics, and Iranian feminisms. Our second speaker is Professor Jonathan Katz. He is an associate professor of practice here at GSWS. And through art history, I should say. He is a pioneering figure in queer art history and curation. He has been teaching for us at GSWS, and I know many students are very familiar with his presence in the classroom this year. We also have with us Tim Holliday, who is a historian of the body, whose work examines intimacy during epidemic disease crises in 18th and 19th century Philadelphia. Tim has just successfully defended his dissertation in the history department just about a week and a half ago. We also have with us Archana Kaku, who is a PhD candidate in political science here at Penn. Her work explores the material destruction of the body as a site where power is enacted, consolidated, and contested. Next, we'll have Maria Murphy. Maria is the interim associate director of the Alice Paul Center. She's working at the intersection of performance, queer politics, and surveillance. And then finally, we'll have Ricardo Bracho. He is our Abrams Artist in Residence at GSWS APC this year and affiliate faculty of LALS. He is a playwright, dramaturge, editor, and teacher who is fast becoming a poet. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shana.
Okay. Sorry, I just need to tinker with some settings here. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this space. Hope you all are doing okay, doing well. I wanted to start with a brief meditation. It's optional. You don't have to do it if you don't feel comfortable. And then I will close with a poem as well. So let's just start by finding a comfortable seat. You can sit on the floor. I'm on the floor. You could sit in a chair, whatever feels best for you. If you have a sensitive back, I recommend sitting up against a wall if you can. Maybe prop your seat up with a pillow if you feel comfortable. And when you're ready, just take a few breaths and start to roll your shoulders back gently. You can roll them back a couple times and then forward. And, you can stretch to the right, stretch to the left, just kind of get all the little kinks out of the day, of the morning. And when you're ready, please find some stillness, and you can place your hands on your knees. If you want to find more grounding, I recommend placing your palms facing down on top of your knees. You can also have them facing up to receive more energy, whatever you'd like. You can also place them on your thighs or just in your lap, whatever you feel most comfortable with. So when you're ready, go ahead and gently close your eyes. If you don't want to close your eyes, you can always take your gaze softly to the floor or something, an object that's still that you can kind of just soften into. And I will let you know when it's time to open our eyes. Another option is, if you like, you can place one hand on your chest. This is in the center of your chest over your heart. This is extremely grounding. And just take a moment and sense how you feel. Take a couple breaths, just some natural breaths in and out. And take a moment to set an intention for the possibility to shift. And when you're ready, go ahead and take a deep, full breath in through the nose, filling the breath into the hand resting on your chest, or just allowing the breath to come in, expanding your rib cage, and then open the mouth, exhale, and let that go. And we're going to do this a couple times together. Taking a deep, full breath, filling in the abdomen, ribs, into the hand on your chest if you have it there. Open your mouth, exhale, let that breath go. And don't rush the breath. One more time, taking a deep breath into the abdomen, into your ribs and your chest. And open the mouth, exhale, let that breath go. Go ahead and take a couple moments to do this on your own, just gently breathing in and breathing out. Don't rush the breath. As you're breathing, try not to judge where your mind wanders. Allow yourself to observe the thought that passes through your mind, and just continue to deepen your breath. And when you're ready, go ahead and take one full breath in and exhale. Let that breath go. Now go ahead and just take a few natural breaths on your own, noticing the difference, sensing how you feel into this moment. And when you're ready, let's go ahead and take a moment and seal our practice with some gratitude. Finding gratitude for being able to connect with each other virtually in this space, in this moment. Maybe you're thinking of a loved one. Gratitude for yourself for showing up. And go ahead and take one last deep breath in and exhale. Let that breath go. When you're ready, you can bring your hands to the center of your chest and start rubbing them together. Have your fingers facing out away from you to build a little heat in your palms. Get that energy going. And once you feel this warmth in your hands, gently place your palms over your eyelids and feel that energy within you. Okay, when you're ready, you can gently float away your hands and open your eyes. All right, so I'm going to read just a little piece from the book Light in the Dark by Gloria Anzaldúa. It's chapter 6 in her book, and the section is called Ritual Prayer Blessing for Transformation. I did change a couple of words just because she is writing this in dedication of her book. Nothing too much, but just a couple things here and there. And I'll do my best with the Spanish. I did practice, so hopefully I will do it some justice. Okay. Every day you visit the sea, walk along Yamaya's glistening shores. You want her to know you, to sense your presence as you sense hers. You know deep down that she's not independent of humans, not indifferent, not set apart. At the lips del mar, you begin your ritual prayer. With the heel of your left foot, you draw a circle in the sand, then walk its circumference, stand at the center, and voice your intention. To increase awareness of spirit, recognize your interrelatedness, and work for transformation. Then, with feather, bone, incense, and water, you attend the spirit's presence. Spirit, embodying yourself as rock, tree, bird, human, past, present, and future. You of many names, diosas antiguas, ancestors, we embrace you as we would a lover. You face east, feel the wind comb your hair, stretch your hands toward the rising sun and its orange filaments. Breathe its rays into your body, and out breath, send your soul up to el sol, say, Are. With each breath, may we remember our interrelatedness. See fibers of spirit extend out from our bodies, creating us, creating sky, seaweed, serpent, y todo la gente. Al alma prende fuego. Burns holes in the walls, separating us, renders them porous and passable, pierces through posturing and pretenses. May we seek and attain wisdom. Moving sunwise, you turn to the south, fuego, inspire and energize us to do the necessary work and to honor it. As we walk through the flames of transformation, may we seize the arrogance to create outrageously, soñar wildly, for the world becomes as we dream it. Facing west, you send your consciousness skimming over the waves toward the horizon, seamless sea and sky. Slipping your hands into el ojo del agua, you speak to the spirit dwelling here on este mar. Agua, may we honor other people's feelings, respect their anger, sadness, grief, joy as we do our own. Though we tremble before uncertain futures, may we meet illness, death, and adversity with strength. May we dance in the face of our fears. You pivot toward the north, squat, scoop sand into your hands, Madre Tierra. You who are our body, who bear us into life, swallow us in death. Forgive us for poisoning your lands. Guide us to wiser ways of caring for you. May we possess the steadfastness of trees, the quiet serenity of dawn, the brilliance of a flashing star. the fluidity of fish in our element. Earth, you who dream us, te damos las gracias. Completing the circle, retornas al centro. Look down to the underworld. May the roaring force of our collective creativity heal the wounds of hate, ignorance, indifference, dissolve the divisions creating chasms between us. Open our throats so we who fear speaking out raise our voices. By our witnessing, find connections through our passions. Pay homage to those whose backs served as bridges. We remember our dead. Pat Parker, Audre Lorde, Toni Cade Bambara, Barbara Cameron, y tantas otras. You raise your head to the sky. May the words and the spirit of this book, of this gathering, our giveaway to the world, take root in our bodies, grow, sprout ears that listen. May it harm no one, exclude none. Sabemos que podemos transformar este mundo, filled with hunger, pain, and war, into a sanctuary of beauty, redemption, and possibility. May the fires of compassion ignite our hands, sending energy out into the universe where it might best be of service. May the love we share inspire others to act. You walk back along the circle, erase the lines en la arena. Leave a tortilla to symbolize feeding the ancestors, feeding ourselves, and the nurturing shared in this gathering. That we gather in our tribe. O Spirit, wind, sun, sea, earth, sky, inside us, all around us, enlivening all, we honor tu presencia and celebrate the spirit of this gathering. We are ready for change. Let us link hands and hearts together, find a path through the dark woods. Step through the doorways between worlds, leaving huellas for others to follow. Build bridges, cross them with grace, and claim these puentas our home. Si se puede, que así sea, so be it. Estamos listas, vámonos. Now let us shift. Contigo, Gloria. All right, I'm going to pass it along to Jonathan. Thank you for listening.
Okay, and so thank you, Shana. That's the greatest piece I've had in over a month. And I just, I think we can all see your gifts in enabling us to really listen carefully for something quiet within us. Thank you for nurturing that in us and for bringing us that piece. I'm going to turn it over now to our visiting scholar, Professor Jonathan Katz.
There we go. So I'm going to be talking about the viral theory of art, and I'm rooting this quite specifically in a moment that has tended to escape notice art historically and culturally, and that is the degree to which AIDS informed the development of our contemporary artistic culture. Strikingly, the images that I'm going to be showing you have tended to, as here, and this is sort of typically activist art by Barbara Kruger, have tended to foreground their social and political purposes. But the art that I'm going to be talking about instead soft pedals it. And it does so for a very particular reason. And that is that in 1989 through 1990, the federal government, under the leadership of right-wing Christian fundamentalist Senator Jesse Helms, promulgated a law that said that no funding for art stemming from the federal government could be used to in any way address questions of homosexuality or AIDS. And so this produced not only a kind of deep freeze on AIDS representation in museums, but it also occurred at a time when there was a great social and political need for exactly that representation. And so artists started to try to, as it were, create content that operated under the nose of dominant culture, but did not necessarily clearly bespeak AIDS and thus fall afoul of the law. So here we have Condoms by Jenny Holzer. In a dream you saw a way to survive and you were full of joy. These are, as far as I've been able to ascertain, the third works of art produced in the United States about AIDS. But the notion of a viral theory draws its real inspiration from this figure. And this is Felix Gonzalez Torres. And Gonzalez Torres actually gave a series of interviews in which he said that he was learning from the virus. This is, of course, not a neutral statement, given that at the point he gave that interview, the virus had already killed his partner, Ross Laycock, whose portrait you were looking at, and would shortly claim his life as well. But he said that the genius of the virus was that it was able to inhabit the very cells that are charged with protecting the body, the immune system cells, and hiding in those cells, reproduce itself and overwhelm the immune system. And Torres said that this was a great model for making activist art, because instead of declaring its intentions and manifesting its clear politics, it was instead working out of camouflage. So Untitled, and this is classically Gonzalez Torres, all of his works begin with the word Untitled and then a directed meeting, Portrait of Ross in LA. And what Portrait of Ross in LA is 178 pounds of candy wrapped and placed in a corner. The candy is the weight of his partner. And we are invited as viewers to pick up and eat a candy. And in so doing, we initiate a whole series of interactions, one of which is, of course, that we are now violating the othering of AIDS, because we are actually approaching someone with AIDS at a moment when that was very rare. Additionally, we are engaging in the Catholic ritual of transubstantiation. And we're also, of course, quite literally violating a lot of the superstitions by putting someone with AIDS into our mouths. But it's this work, I think, above all, that has come to represent what I'm calling the viral theory of art. It first appeared as a billboard in New York, Soho, and it quickly grew to 10, 12 billboards. When I first saw these, I had no idea what they were about. In fact, I confess I thought they were Bed Bath & Beyond advertisements. And I thought this was a trendy mode of making advertising, and we would shortly find out that everything was 25% off. But it didn't happen. And over time, I started thinking about these, and other people started thinking about these, and realized that this is a bed with clearly, right, the impression of two absented bodies. And thus, right, we found a work of art that circulated publicly that had no clear denotative AIDS content, but was richly connotative. So rich, in fact, that Ronnie Horn, a friend of Felix Gonzalez Torres, produced this work, Gold Mats Paired for Ross and Felix, in which two gold sheets alternately attract and repel one another, thematizing the coupledom that was one of the defining elements of their work. And then Joy Episala, in a wonderfully arch kind of, and I think loving but sharp critique of the work, shows us two pillows in photographs placed on the ground. You can see that they're on the ground at the intersection of the wall, and the top pillow is extremely dirty because this sanitizes the scene of AIDS in a way that, of course, social reality didn't always bear out, and also, importantly, sexualizes it, one pillow on top of the other. And then, in a remarkable, and I think clear shift in epics and thinking about sort of epochal norms, Dean Samashima, in Between Days Without You, takes a series of photographs of beds in bathhouses where he has just had anonymous sex. And so from the key of mourning, elegy, and loss in the original work, we now have, right, an image of sexual pleasure and fantasy, a reclaiming of sexuality in the Age of AIDS. David Wojnarowicz takes a cue from Gonzalez Torres, and in Untitled Buffalo, Untitled again, the first word, and then Buffalo directing us, he actually photographs the diorama at the American Museum of Natural History that shows indigenous hunting techniques driving buffalo off cliffs. It's simply a rephotographing of that diorama. There's nothing else that's happened to it. But of course, in the context of AIDS and David's AIDS activism, it assumes a very particular and richly metaphorical significance. Importantly, Ronald Lockett also picks up on that buffalo theme, Facing Extinction from 1994. But Ronald Lockett is not at all part of the New York art world. He's from Bessemer, Massachusetts. He's an African-American artist, untrained, and yet making these extraordinary works in the same, out of the same idiom. And then Frank Moore, years later, picks it up in the work Lullaby by giving us a hospital bed with those same bison now roaming, potentially now endangered. Patty Loper gives us an image of a high, pristine, modernist interior, exactly the kind of thing you'd see in an architectural review, except if you look carefully, a deer has broken through the plate glass window and is about to wreak havoc on this interior. Scott Burton's two-part chair, where we see an image of a chair that was, in fact, quite literally used to seat the captains of industry as they sat in the lobbies of major office buildings, but also encodes gay male sexuality in a way that they cannot see, and of course encode something else, because if you move these two stones apart, they collapse. They need to be together to hold up. Milk Blood, looking like nothing so much as an Ellsworth Kelly hard-edged abstraction, but of course the two key sources of HIV transmission, along with this one, Semen and Blood, looking like an abstract expressionist painting. Jim Hodges putting up these spider webs almost undetectably in the top of galleries where two walls meet in the corner, 10 feet above the ground, but of course, a web that catches everyone. Safe journey to some safe place. Anyone. Helpless, hopeless. And this remarkable work, again by Felix Gonzalez Torres, Placebo, in which 1,200 pounds of candy are placed on the floor, 1,200 equaling the amount of T4 helper cells in ideal formation. And finally, a work by Kari Yamaoka that I think speaks strongly to this entire moment. She takes the book, Steal This Book, by the great Yippie author, Jerry Rubin, and she whites out every word on the page but two, slaughter and history. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we're going to have Tim Holliday, PhD, who will speak to us on the birth of a new pestilence, chronicling illness in the time of COVID-19.
Thank you, Kathy. Between the 1790s and the 1850s, the residents of Philadelphia were ravaged by a series of epidemics in which a familiar disease returned with exceptional devastation, an entirely novel disease appeared, and a misunderstood disease acquired a newly distinctive identity. That is to say that not just yellow fever, but also cholera and typhus infected the city, disproportionately affecting and killing the impoverished, the institutionalized, and people of color. Physicians of the time used intimate care practices to make sense of these diseases and disease in general, as well as the human body. I define intimacy as a value-neutral condition of physical and sensory proximity that can acquire a positive or negative valence based on context. So intimate care practices were care practices that hinged upon this proximity. Physicians employed such practices strategically to bolster their claims to professional authority. Writing from the perspective of the 21st century, I remarked in an early version of the epilogue to my dissertation with more than a touch of grad school-induced hubris that, at least in the global north, the 21st century was characterized by epidemics of a chronic nature. I based this claim on the work of scholars like sociologist Brian Turner, who as early as 1987 wrote almost wistfully that, quote, "The age of heroic medicine has been replaced by the mundane medical management of chronic as opposed to acute illness." Well, by now we all know that that version of my epilogue aged poorly. In recent weeks, I've seen my work become relevant in ways I had hoped it never would. In the early 19th century, as cholera wended its fatal way throughout Eurasia, a writer for Britain's Quarterly Review remarked, "We have witnessed in our days the birth of a new pestilence." So I recognize that the parallels between cholera and COVID are imperfect at best. For one, the latter disease spread much more quickly in a matter of months rather than years. On the other hand, cholera killed more quickly. Cholera time was measured in hours, not days or weeks. And although not contagious in the ways that COVID-19 is, cholera killed 1 in 3 of its symptomatic sufferers. Social distancing, which is also called physical distancing, precludes the kinds of physical and sensory proximity that I define as intimate. It's not a new concept. By other names, social distancing has taken the form of quarantines, lazarettos, leper colonies, cordons sanitaires, sanitariums, the list goes on. In 19th century Philadelphia, as elsewhere, these strategies of disease containment often went hand in hand with xenophobia, racism, classism, the works. Add homophobia to the list, and it might sound a bit like social distancing in the age of HIV. Treating yellow fever, cholera, and typhus in the 18th and 19th centuries all entailed intimate exposure to sick bodies and bodily fluids. The deeply intimate treatment regimens that institutional physicians employed could not always save the patient. But in failing to save the patient, these regimens did not fail the clinical physician who carefully juxtaposed pre- and post-mortem observations of patients' bodies in order to produce new knowledge about disease and the body. So to paraphrase Johanna Hedva, in 19th century Philadelphia, the logic of clinical intimacy required some patients to die. In the time of COVID-19, the very same physical and sensory proximity upon which healthcare workers rely might for laypersons alleviate some of the emotional toll of social distancing or physical distancing. But unlike in the time of cholera, that proximity can spread disease, even if it can also refine our understanding of it. So I wanted to keep my presentation brief, so I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
Thank you, Tim. We're now going to turn over to Archana.
Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction, and Shana and Maria, thank you for all of your work. organizing. Let's see if I can get this screen share situation cooperating with us. Almost there. Okay. So as we know, I'm talking about COVID-19, 9/11, and contamination. So over the last 2 months, comparisons between the novel coronavirus pandemic and September 11th, 2001 bombings seem to be everywhere. Except not on that slide, which is frozen. But tempered by a smaller number of pieces, insisting that these comparisons are faulty. And indeed, these critiques can marshal some very compelling facts. First, this pandemic is global rather than site-specific. Second, on 9/11, hospitals discovered to their horror that they were over-prepared. You might recall photos like this one of gurneys waiting uselessly in the street for the injured who never came. This stands in sharp contrast to today's overburdened and overflowing hospitals. And third, the acts of solidarity that characterized post-9/11 America are potentially deadly today, when public mourning has become a high-risk behavior. What is so striking about these comparisons, and this is perhaps the most striking headline of this kind that I've seen, is how they feel simultaneously inevitable and yet implausible. Why is this the case? I suggest that these comparisons are impelled by anxieties surrounding infection and contamination, which have been expressed in contemporary American culture more cogently with respect to fears of terrorism than fears of disease. Perhaps going back to Tim's epilogue. We have grown to regard vaccination with skepticism, disease with disregard. We felt, before now, insulated and even invincible in the face of the stricken world outside. And so we reappropriated the language we might use to express these fears to reflect the fears we have cultivated instead. The language of the virus, of biological threat, and of contamination have become the language for discussing terrorism. I'm not going to do air quotes every time I say terrorism, but hear the air quotes every time I say it. So to illustrate these anxieties at work, I want to offer 2 provocations for our consideration. First, the widespread discourse referring to suicide bombers and terrorism more generally as a virus, and second, the rhetoric of the so-called war on terror in parallel with the rhetoric from the present struggle against the virus. And I'll conclude by offering some reflections on what the fear of contamination might mean for responses to the current pandemic. So let me begin with the ubiquitous description of terrorism as a virus. These are only a few of the many headlines, not to mention academic articles, configured in the same way. Suicide bombing is a virus that's here to stay. Security-oriented discourse regarding suicide bombers has an immunopathological valence. Terrorism is an infection in the body politic. It lies hidden in secret cells and waits to attack when our immune resistances are low. These analyses treat suicide bombing itself as contagious. One suicide bombing can spread, producing more bombers and more attacks. It isn't just about inspiration. These metaphors suggest something fundamentally biological about the way this threat is interpreted. To the second point. Starting on March 16th, Trump began referring to the coronavirus as the invisible enemy almost every single day, sometimes more than once in a single appearance. Against this invisible enemy, Trump positions himself rhetorically as a wartime president, fighting the toughest war of all. Here's an example of that language, and it should sound very familiar. Indeed, we can look at this very small snippet from Bush's address to the nation that launched the war on terror and see the proximity between the two. Now, of course, both presidents had instrumental reasons for deploying this language. The language of warfare comes with increased control over resources, and it comes with higher approval ratings. But I think there's something more here. These appeals reflect parallel interpretations of these 2 events. Discourses surrounding the war on terror were replete with images of unseen and hidden enemies. Enemies who might be within and who had to be detected through surveillance and measured through the ideological test of either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Thus, these 2 ciphers, COVID-19, and 9/11 seem inevitably linked in our national consciousness because they mobilize the same fears of contagion, of pollution, and of biohazard. The same fears that infiltration brings the seeds of limitless death and decay. In the aftermath of 9/11, we were told that terrorists had slipped unseen and undetected through our porous, penetrable boundaries and into our body politic. We were told that where there is risk of contamination, we must take no chances. We must quarantine the exposed, isolate them in holding cells, detention centers, and ghost sites. We must be vigilant, always, for symptoms. If you see something, say something. This way of thinking may seem rational. In fact, it may even seem necessary in the face of our current pandemic. But 9/11 also taught us to beware the effects of what seems like comforting security. This is not a hypothetical caution. The warrantless surveillance provisions of the Patriot Act, perhaps the most infamous piece of post-9/11 legislation, expired last month, while Congress, busy with the coronavirus stimulus package, failed to pass any reform or replacement. But a so-called savings clause in the law allows authorities to continue their warrantless investigations, now ungoverned by any live legislation that activists might fight against. Earlier this week, and again today, Trump announced his intention to stop all immigration into the United States, a sweeping extension of his infamous and supposedly anti-terrorist Muslim ban policy because of coronavirus. Linked fears produce linked results. Looking to the troubles of the war on terror and the aftermath of 9/11 may provide a cautionary tale of a familiar but different kind of decay with which we are now faced. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Archana. That's really important work, and I know you've got us all really interested to monitor your own progress as you move toward getting your PhD in political science here at Penn. Thank you for sharing it with us. Now I'm going to turn things over to our interim associate director of the Alice Paul Center, Maria Murphy.
Welcome. Welcome to quarantine, where technocratic infrastructure can facilitate our workflow, perpetuate the distribution of product, and get that pandemic productivity really humming. Welcome to Microsoft Teams and Zoom, where you could end up stuck as Potato Boss. Or porn bots could invade your online classroom. Some of these programs feel overwhelming, and some seem to be keeping track of everything we do. But what's a little undisclosed data mining in quarantine? We're used to a little surveillance by now, aren't we? We've learned that increased so-called security means increased surveillance. We've seen increased state surveillance tactics that have been intimately connected with notions of citizenship and patriotism. How else does a state express love for its citizens, after all, but to promise security in exchange for access to information? We might need to find hope in thinking about the potential relational modes between the intimacies of pleasure and surveillance. Even the pleasure of hopelessness. Even the pleasure and power of submission. Masochism. accepting the paternal surveillance state for the daddy that it is. Daddy is everywhere, of course, substantiating a control paradigm over the US nation as it tracks our movements from city to city, collecting our medical history, watching us watch porn, supposedly protecting us from all vague sources of danger and evil.
Today, my quarantine offering is a performance as part of my ongoing research project on the U.S. security state and surveillance technologies. I'll be sharing a special daddy-inspired performance of Anoni's Watch Me from her 2016 album, Hopelessness.
Watch me in my hotel room, daddy, daddy. Watch my outline as I move from city to city. Watch me watching pornography, daddy, daddy. Watch me talking to my friends and my family. I know you love me, 'cause you're always watching me, daddy, daddy. I know you love me, 'cause you're always watching me, protecting me from evil, protecting me from terrorism, protecting me from child molesters, protecting me from evil.
Watch me, watch me, watch me, watch me, watch me, watch me. Thanks, Kathy, everyone.
Thank you, Maria. That was totally amazing. I'm just speechless. I had no idea you had such an amazing set of voices. So thank you for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to our Abrams Artist in Residence for this year, Ricardo Bracho.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to read poems that I've been writing under quarantine. And this is called Writing Prompts. I search the morning for insight. Somewhere in the sound of coming light are words that will act as key. Blank needed no keys. He could get in, break into anything. Parties and buildings and smiles. Dear Blank, I'm sorry it's been a long time since I've written to you. But Blank is not your name. Your name, his name is blank, 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 and blank, and blank. They, you, he, don't read or believe a word I write. And this is a poem I wrote for Diane Rodriguez, who had like a 40-year career in theater and was, very much partially responsible for my having a national theater career, and passed about 2 weeks ago. Non-COVID related, but we all nationally could not gather. So this is called There's No Place to Gather. There's no place to gather without you, Diane. You are gone, and we need to be in your living room with wine and marigolds, the colors of them, a red so deep and liquid, almost black, a yellow so yellow it becomes gold, pollinated by sunlight and your ringing laughter. The colors red, black, yellow, gold, present everywhere, like your presence, everywhere. Your hair and lips, lipstick jewels bounce and adjust on your wrist, solar plexus. You are solar, we orbit in the room. You invite me to meet she, this actress, Puerto Rican, fabulous, you will love her. The women who make up your constant we, as ever-changing as the red and gold LA sunsets, the black and blue metal skyline, these women, visible, audible oracles. The men pretty and hardy, pretty wounded hearts, frail and full and firm bodies, we bring marigolds to your altar, but no prayers are said. Instead, we make a ceremony, a circle of chisme and empty glasses. We are theater people, teatristas to be OG about it. But that isn't quite it, is it, Diane? No, we are lovers come together to rehearse our desires. With you as director, sister, with you our radiant lipstick and bejeweled center. And I have been, since I started this position, on a haiku rampage. I wrote a chapbook worth of poems last semester called Salt of Him, and I've been working this semester on a collection called Obsidian Heart. And these are the poems, the haikus I've written since I've been under quarantine. This then, I guess there is this then, men I will lust and want, always already. Medium for materialists. Walter Benjamin's Angel of History is pissed off from her perch. Obituary for tomorrow. Can't rhyme the next line. Ceaseless obituary. Sans syncopation. The children of Lot's wife for New York. We are her children, holding a hand turned to dust. Remember murder. The designated mourner. Those designated to mourn, to remember, to dream the unseen, cry. Conversation with ghost. Where have you been, love? Hiding in your sleep, sleeping. Feel me toss, rustle. Phantom touch. Not everyone but him, his touch, his grasp, his fists, the way he pulled hair. There you are, full moon, glowing pink, alone, hurting, the night John Prine died. Life is so fragile, the precipice of contact, a teacup bulldozed. Translation, seduction. Inuit means miel, the honey contained within. Its sweetness means you. Spring, sing to me now, today we bury many, unheralded, loved. Morning walks alone. Don't you see them? Her and him? They dart, fly beside. We two and a bed, the beauty of hurt, silence. Now we three make love. Secular prayer against racism. I pray you don't pray, you predator and carcass. We accursed can curse. Insomnia. Don't want to dream you in muddled reality, here and there and gone. From the cock, from the front to the back room. Get into it, girl. Get into you. Sniff, sweat. Man, min, Mona foot. Our world emptied now, morning without rush hour. Birds speak while I break. I scramble my breathing. We all had it, yet I am the only one left. The thing about words, hurt, jab, pounce, and our bruises, on skin left untouched. Mornings without you aren't miracles, aren't any fun, a world left unsweet. I could name this sex, use one of the many names you made me cry, God. An early spring in plague times. Pink blossoms cascade. The thought of our sex still makes my heart and blood race. For Marion Saint Laurent in Milan in a time of plague. You write of Beckett while witnessing quarantine. This last line, silence. Conversations with my dead. I've been with the dead. They say there is no honor in panic shelves. And my last one is called After Watching Heavenly Bodies, which is a documentary made by Vishnu Das about the great artist Stephen Arnold. And it's for my friend Christopher. I want to lie in grass with you, look skyward, while you speak of the heavens within, talk of books and boys, laughter, smoke and look at flowers, talk and hear boys' laughter. I want to walk with you, riverside, and then by buildings we make disappear with our dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, everyone. I think what we'd like to do now is give the participants a chance, if they wish, to speak to each other first. So if you feel so moved, anyone who's been part of this presentation and you would like to speak to each other in any way that feels appropriate to you, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just be aware of the dynamics of the little Zoom screens lining up so that we don't talk over each other.
Well, just to Maria. Go ahead, girl.
I just want to also echo Kathy to say thank you all for participating. It was really rich to see how so much of all the work that you are already doing intersects and can offer some insight and some comfort during these very challenging times, to say the least.
Thank you, Maria, for organizing, and Shana for organizing this. Thank you all for participating. We are going to be taking questions from anybody who's viewing this on YouTube. You can access or you can send us questions on the Zoom chat format. And if I've got that wrong, Maria, I know you can correct me.
You can type comments on YouTube right on the stream. And hopefully Shana or Kathy can see them, because I cannot at this time. Shana can.
Yeah, I'm taking a look. We don't have any questions yet, but if anyone in this group has a question or comment, feel free to get the conversation started, and I can interject when we have a couple questions coming through. Is that okay?
Perhaps I could start. This is a question that's up for grabs, perhaps most closely related to Jonathan, Tim, Ricardo's topics, but just kind of considering that in this moment we've been talking about so many different strategies, or not strategies, but rather the inability to fully mourn those who have passed away. And Ricardo, I was very touched by your words and the context that you set for the poems that you were sharing. So I was wondering if I could ask either you or perhaps Jonathan to comment on, not to see similarities necessarily with your research in this exact moment, but if we could talk a little bit about, in these moments of isolation and the kind of the lack of opportunity to mourn our loved ones. And if you would like to respond, you just have to unmute yourself.
Ricardo, you want to do it, or do you want me to take it?
You.
Like me. Okay. So I think that one of the most compelling aspects that we've seen is that, to put it bluntly, during AIDS it felt two different worlds we inhabited. One that was absolutely in the throes of the most devastating plague we had ever seen, and in which 20-year-olds were aping the language of 80-year-olds and talking about funerals and their burial arrangements. And then another world that seemed completely unconcerned. We're now at a place culturally where I think there's a lot of ritual genuflection towards a sense of loss, but I keep seeing, and I suppose this is sort of to be expected, that only in the moments when it becomes personalized, when it becomes absolutely directed and clear, does the form of cultural mourning take on a kind of weight and significance. Up till then, it just sort of feels like lip service. And I've seen repeatedly the trope of, I didn't take this seriously until, and then, then someone all of a sudden comes to understand. I guess what I'm trying to say is our culture doesn't seem to have the necessary notion of collective identity and uplift to allow us to fully and I think radically identify with everyone else's losses across the board. And that, I hope, is a lesson we learn from this.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I also have a question, I think, for Archana. Your presentation was really making me thinking about basically the kind of, not just affective, but the material force of language, of rhetoric that seemed to be such an important part of your research on kind of the post-9/11 world and the war on terror, and certainly right now, and we are also, language seems to be the grounds on which we're fighting, how we discuss this virus and how it's impacting at such a global level. I'm wondering if you can talk about that, that actual kind of the consequences of rhetoric and language, perhaps in the political frame in which you're discussing, or more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. And I think maybe I can do this in a way that will also connect to the question that Jonathan just answered for us. Because I think what I'm seeing and what I see in my research on suicide bombing and 9/11 as well is that there is actually a sort of very firm material bodily basis for some of these fears, and that sometimes manifests in our reactions to it, but not in the ways that we would expect. So for example, after 9/11, I didn't get to talk about this in the presentation so much, but there's a real material concern with decontaminating the site, right, particularly the World Trade Center site, and not just of all of the sort of toxic pollutants that were unleashed when the buildings collapsed, right, this sort of vast cloud of asbestos, but also about needing to gather up every little potential bit of the hijackers' bodies that could be found and purify it away from the site. And actually, to this day, everything they've found of the hijackers' remains is stored in undisclosed evidence lockers in New York and Virginia. So there's a sort of real, very material way in which these fears play out. And I think in the same way, and this maybe goes to the question of public mourning that you were asking, Jonathan, we see these sort of two different strands of horror, I think, in the discourse around coronavirus right now. One is so many people are dying, and I think on that one we can kind of, it's what we expect. But there's also this cross-cutting concern about there are too many bodies, right? And we saw this in New York, that the morgues were overflowing, that they had to set up trailers. You may have seen a headline in Philly about bodies being moved on the back of a flatbed pickup truck, that they were starting more mass burials on a kind of a pauper's grave island outside of New York. This sort of concern about the profusion of bodies that are dead and therefore maybe not the same kind of threat of contamination, and yet that we have this concern about how they can be managed in a way that's both kind of in keeping with our cultural idea of mourning, but also that manages our anxieties around the existence of those corpses in the first place. So I think management is really the term that I come back to over and over again in thinking about both of these, right? The management of bodies and the management of corpses, and how that's kind of reflecting the rhetorical strategies that we use to think about them.
So,
Can I grab that?
Please.
Just to say that yesterday was the anniversary of Prince's death, and today is Lenin's birthday. And not only is there sort of my politics encapsulated between those two poles, but I think both the politics of pleasure and of funk and of sexuality, they're so ever present in all of Prince's work, and how to collectivize and against the state and also win the state. And Lenin, how are we going to do this after COVID? Like, how do we have intimacy? How do we have collectivization? So where do we go? Who do we touch? What can be stopped? What can be started? I think that's where we'll begin.
So if I can just build on that and try to draw Tim and Archana into thinking about this. So much of what we've heard about COVID has also pivoted around age, and certainly the kind of devastation of populations in nursing homes. And I'm thinking about comments that many people have made about loss and loss of final moments and loss of mourning, but also a kind of guilt of people whose, parents and older loved ones and relatives are in nursing homes and then prove to be oh so vulnerable, in some cases sort of the first ravages of the disease on those populations. So I wonder if Tim and Archana might just kind of think out loud with us as some of the up and coming scholars thinking about the body and thinking about disease, and in the kind of, the generation beyond the scourge of AIDS, the initial scourge of AIDS, what does this look like for you? How do you see your own politics shaped by being the kind of, the heirs of the AIDS plague, but also people who are watching the kind of politics of age unfold at this moment in this pandemic?
Would you like to go first, Archana, or?
No, I got to talk. You go ahead.
Okay. I guess I would say, as a historian, I think of myself not just as the heir of the AIDS crisis, but I've started thinking of myself as the heir of the typhus crisis, the cholera crisis, because these crises changed the way that people thought about bodies, living bodies and dead bodies. One of the things that was really striking to me in my work is looking at how, for instance, cholera provoked kind of an interest in intestinal anatomy, which then led to sort of physicians producing new knowledge about typhus versus typhoid. And throughout these historical epidemics, you have kind of the same sort of politics of not just of age, but of, as I said, of class, of race playing out, where certain people are more vulnerable to disease for whatever reason. And in ravaging communities and families, diseases like cholera and especially yellow fever, I think, disrupted mourning practices, disrupted cultures of death in places like Philadelphia. So maybe Archana can add to that.
Well, as a non-historian, perhaps, something that I've been interested is thinking about the way that we kind of relate disease and the other. And of course, we talk about this all the time with HIV/AIDS, right? That disease is something that happens to queer people, to people outside the general population. And I actually think we saw a version of that again early in this pandemic. Not just with the Chinese virus, right, a discourse that we know we're all still dealing with, but actually with the over-identification of this disease with the elderly. And of course, there is some basis in that people who are immunocompromised or otherwise have weakened immune systems are more susceptible to any virus. But there was this very repeated discourse that you won't get it, the elderly will get it, right? Or if you get it, you'll be fine. So there's this sort of way that we find different pieces of the population to designate as the susceptible other. And that's been particularly interesting to me in the analysis that I kind of wanted to work through here today. As someone with like 1 foot in the first and 1 foot in the third world, not to kind of reduce those too much, but to see the difference in that reaction, right, in the third world where we have a little bit more familiarity with the idea of vulnerability to disease, right, that even when COVID-19 struck, that it was kind of the inheritor of SARS or some of these other diseases that have circulated through Asia in the very recent past, certainly on a different scale. But the familiarity with disease is something that happens to us and to our bodies and to the sort of body politic, as opposed to something that happens to that group over there that is not us, right? Disease is one of the ways, I think, particularly in the United States, in discourse that we use to define the other. The other is susceptible to disease. The general population is free of it. So I think it becomes another way that we create these divisions, but also that they sort of perpetuate themselves. And I think coming out of the sort of era of HIV/AIDS, certainly that's a concern that, well, I don't want to say it interests me, but it does. It interests me thinking about the different ways that elements of health and elements of the kind of material body are used to differentiate between us.
Can I follow up with a question to Tim and Archana as well, I suppose? But I completely sort of take the point about the target populations and how certain populations are deemed sort of naturally susceptible. And that's, of course, how ideology enters the functioning of disease. To what extent can we clearly map that historically in terms of cholera and yellow fever?
Right. So one of the things that historians of the body and scholars of the body more generally have talked about is the difference between illness and disease. And this sort of gets to what Archana was talking about, I think. So it's good, Jonathan, that you brought this into the discussion, because I was going to anyway. That disease is something that is sort of socially and historically constituted, so that it's possible for us in a kind of abstract way to talk about someone being ill without being diseased, and maybe even vice versa. So that I'm going to speak about cholera and yellow fever and typhus, just because that's sort of what I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years. So these were diseases that, as I said, were kind of associated with institutionalized people, especially typhus, and people of color, poor people, and I think that was that parallels in interesting ways the ways that HIV and now COVID are being associated with, as diseases being associated with certain populations, such that, so maybe if you are under the age of 60 or whatever, or if you don't have a chronic illness, you might get ill, but you won't be diseased in the way that someone over the age of 60 or with a chronic illness might be considered part of a diseased population. And I think that there's ways that can relate to HIV, especially with the initial and to some extent lasting association with, I think that was referred to as like the 4-H disease, homosexuals, Haitians, hemophiliacs, and heroin users. So that's, sort of parallels the historical epidemics that I'm interested in. And I can't really speak more in depth about that, but I see the parallels for sure.
We do have a question. If I could go ahead and read it from Sophie Lewis. Thank you, Sophie. This question is for Maria. Sophie says, Maria, I loved your performance. Agree that surveillance, the state relation, is widely and in a deep sense masochistically pleasurable for humans, even as it is an anti-free and unpleasurable for us as well. Could you comment on the problem which seems to emerge from your work here of doing politics against certain pleasures without jettisoning it desire, especially collective desire?
That's an awesome question. I'll do my best to respond. Is the audio normal? I'm hearing a weird echo. Okay. I think with this, I think it is a very delicate balance. Not that I know that I am striking that balance at all. This remains experimental for me in my work. But I do think, what Anoni is touching on with her piece and how I've tried to kind of reinterpret in a little bit, but still kind of play true to her initial track, is that, whether it ends up pleasure and desire at a collective or individual level ends up being perhaps like really a mode of survival or a survival technique that, there are, to find pleasure in whatever our material conditions might be and with those consequences. So I don't know that I feel confident that I am sort of walking that line of kind of playing with the idea of pleasure and masochism under a very oppressive surveillance state. Yet it is something that I'm trying to experiment with as, as kind of finding pleasure as a mode, as a means of survival.
I just want to add, we also received a comment from Nancy Hirschman, who said she had difficulty figuring out how to make the comment directly to us because she was instructed that she needed to create her own YouTube channel to do it. And she felt daunted by that, as I would, I have to say. But she wanted to let us know that she really loved all the presentations and thought they just were, I know she's been looking for some solace and some intellectual solace and some feminist solace. So I hope I'm not speaking too much for her, but that was the sense I got from her message.
I also have one other question that I'd like to pose to both Shana and Ricardo, if that's all right. I was really excited to hear poetry as important bookends to frame this event, and so I was wondering if you could talk about what poetry as a medium might be affording us in this moment. I certainly can speak to the necessity of it for me in this moment, but I would love to hear from both of you, please.
Shana, you or me?
Go ahead.
I'll tell you some Gloria Anzaldúa stories later. I think of it as sort of, I mean, for me, it's the condensation of and distillation of this experience into, both an aesthetic mode that doesn't sort of fall into just an endless stream of clickbait. So that how do we pay witness when we are removed from witnessing? Because that is our condition. I mean, like I interact with my roommate, and we see the people we see at the supermarket or at the store behind masks. So how then do we witness, and how do we critique and counter ideology? And for me, right now, that mode is poetry.
I might not be answering your question entirely, Maria, but I'm just going to go with what I'm thinking about. I guess with I was called to, this piece kind of called to me. I actually read this piece after the election, and I was in a moment where I just needed some comfort. I needed some sense of grounding, some sense that there is this energy, that there is this connectedness, even though the times are so dark. And so as we were talking actually about putting this event together, I thought of this poem, and I think, Kathy, you kind of touched on this, how it's like a prayer, but not necessarily tied to like anything particularly in a religious way. It's just kind of like a call for all of us to kind of find connection and feel a bit more grounded in ourselves and with each other. But yeah, I think that's all I have to really say about poetry. I myself am not a poet. I don't write poetry. I do creative writing. But I did find that this piece just kind of spoke to me in terms of like, kind of, I guess, responding to crisis in a way of finding this interconnectedness with each other. So I hope that answers your question a little. Thank you.
And Maria, on the same point, I just wanted to share an observation, which is, I think, very curious, that when administered and instrumentalized language, the language of our everyday lives, recedes, as it does at this moment, an emotional tenor and an emotional language supersedes. And it tells us something about how we live everyday life, right? That it seems primarily at moments like this that we connect to one another on an emotional level.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to just give us one last chance if anybody has any kind of parting words to conclude this event. Is anybody feel moved to speak? Ricardo?
Well, just because I'm getting questions and comments about it, my cape is by Alon Herrera, and you can go to him on nolacostume.com. And the print is by Bay Boggs, and she's based out of LA, and Alon is in New Orleans. So just people were asking, you know, Queens. Sorry.
Very good, very good. Nobody's asked me, but this beach is in my mind. This is what I would like my mind to be like pretty much until May 1st. Then it can, you know, go to hell in a handbasket as it normally does. Okay, so I just want to say for our YouTube audience, thank you to Shana and Maria for organizing this for us, but also thank you to Shana, Jonathan, Tim, Archana, Maria, and Ricardo for, you know, giving us so much to feel and to think with, and really filling us up so that we can go on with our day, with our week, with the rest of April, with the rest of this period of pandemic. It has been very fulfilling and also very nourishing in all kinds of ways to be able to be part of this. So thank you all so much. And thank you everybody who came to join us and to listen and participate and think with us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.